The MC is talking about the highlight of this week's MFC main match, featuring Jae Ki-young, who subdues his opponent with a guillotine choke, and then praising Jae Ki-young's strikes and jiu-jitsu skills that ultimately lead to him having a clean hit in a very timely manner. It was a commentary on the video that Lil Potato intently watched and study, and all the while, he can't help but admire our hotshot seaman. Most of the members of the gym calls him Potato, but his real name is Hwang Yoon-gu, the youngest gym member at the age of 20. It had always been his dream to become a world-class MMA fighter like his idol Jae Ki-young. It's for that reason alone that he moved to Seoul all the way from the province. At least, that was the idea. Since Potato is still basically an amateur, it's no wonder that he's the only one who has yet to experience his first official match. So, whenever the other members have matches, he's the only one left to hold the fort, the gym's errand boy. And although he felt a bit disappointed, it didn't really discourage him. His seniors are also very encouraging, so it's not like he feels totally left out. And it's not like it's just Potato who's being left behind. Even baby Dan isn't coming with the athletes, and the most he can do is wish them the best and have fun. After everyone else have left, the cautious and distant Potato asks Dan if Jae Ki-young is coming to the gym. Dan honestly replies that he is, in about an hour after finishing his offset appointments for the day. Potato is in awe of the fact that Dan knows Jae Ki-young's whole schedule. Since they're not that close to be having more small talks than that, Dan excuses himself and wishes Potato the best for his training. As Potato sees Dan going inside the coach's office, he thinks about how Dan is living with his precious Hee-young and how that doesn't sit right with him. Is this how younger brothers with sis-cons feel when their sisters marry? Anyways, Potato starts his training with jumping rope, and as he did, he kept on thinking about the things that he admires about Jae Ki-young. Like how jumping rope is easy to the star athlete, the fact that his physique and technique are perfect. To our innocent little Potato, Jae Ki-young is the kind of person who only appears once in millennia. And that's just not because he's a millennial, probably. Just as Potato makes a mistake after getting distracted by fanboying, Jae Ki-young arrives at the gym, and so Potato greets him excitedly. Jae Ki-young asks Potato if everyone has left for the match, which the younger athlete confirms, all the while thinking about it's just him and Jae Ki-young training in the gym now. That is until Dan emerges from his cave, which is the coach's office, and starts talking to Jae Ki-young. Potato once again is in awe of how the two are close. The kid thinks that the only reason the two of them are living together is because they're pretty tight as friends. After all, even in the gym, Jae Ki-young isn't as friendly as he is like with baby Dan. Oh, they're very close, that's for sure. The point is, Lil Potato is jealous of Dan. He, too, wants to be close to his Hee-young, get guidance and praise from his idol, and get to train with him. Clearly, he's thinking about a Jae Ki-young from an alternate dimension. But hey, if that gets him motivated, let's just support him. Later that day, Jae Ki-young is hitting the bags when Potato approaches him and asks him to hold his mitt for a bit. Jae Ki-young didn't beat around the bush and just straight up refused the kid's request. What a jerk. Well, it was expected of him, but still a jerk move. Anyways, when Potato asks why, Jae Ki-young just told him to ask one of their gym mates the next day. Jae Ki-young then tells Potato that his basic posture still needs a lot of work, and that he should stop interrupting him. This upset Potato so much. After all, he's always focusing on working on his posture every day. Still, it wasn't enough for Jae Ki-young to even at least hold his mitts for him. High standard much. Anyways, that was the end of the conversation and Jae Ki-young returned to his bag. Not long after, Potato takes a break and watches Jae Ki-young train. Safe to say he's in a very foul mood. Dan notices this and comes to talk. He asks Potato if he's alright or if he's hurt anywhere. When Potato responds that he's fine, Dan then asks him if he's okay with being left behind while everyone else has matches. Potato is cool with it, of course. After all, this way, he can stay behind and watch his Hee-young train. Potato then asks Dan why he didn't go with the rest of the team, since if Dan wasn't there, it's just going to be him and Jae Ki-young left. Not that his situation is going to get any better with Jae Ki-young that way. Anyways, Dan admits that he wants to go and watch, but Jae Ki-young wouldn't allow it. This answer puts a question mark in Little Potato's head. How come Dan needs Jae Ki-young's permission to go just because he's Jae Ki-young's personal physio? Unless there's something more between them, Potato, young as he is the most perceptive in this series so far, but thinking that there's no way something could really be happening between the two just because they're both guys, Potato dismisses those thoughts. Suddenly, Jae Ki-young comes in their direction and, without a word, pulls Dan inside the break room, even locking it for privacy. Potato's immediate thought is that Jae Ki-young is getting treatment from his personal physio, Dan, although he did wonder why the dude is being so rough. Just as Potato gets up to continue his workout, he hears something crash inside the room the two disappear into, followed by some suspicious noises. A hum. Of course, Potato's immediate course of action is to go near the door and wonder what all the commotion is about. And I say, stop right there. That's not something an innocent kid like you should get involved in. You're too young for this little Potato. The crash heard from outside by Potato is, in fact, Jae Ki-young trying to get it on with his physio. Dan tries to talk him out of it, or at least they should just get home first. After all, there's still Potato outside who might catch them. Selfish jerk Jae Ki-young won't hear it, of course, since first of all, he's already in the mood. He also points out that Dan likes these thrills himself, reminding him of that time they did it in the gym shower room. It should be fine as long as they don't get caught. Dan still insists that there's no way they can get away with it this time and that little Potato will get the shock of his life if he catches them. No dip, Sherlock. Although annoyed, Jae Ki-young had no choice but to comply with Dan's insistence, telling him to wait right there while he goes to get rid of the kid. Meanwhile, Potato is trying to investigate what is happening inside the room. It's trying to eavesdrop in the door, wondering what could really be going on. After all, Jae Ki-young's treatments with Dan are usually quite unlike today, making Potato wonder if perhaps the two of them are fighting, thus the noise. Potato is so close to the door when Jae Ki-young opens it that it almost hits him. Thinking about how he's been caught, Potato tries to make an excuse about why he's by the door. Although, Jae Ki-young didn't really care. That was so close, though. The hottie should be glad he listened to Baby Gan. Anyways, Jae Ki-young tells Potato to get him coffee and hands him the black card. Potato is so excited at the thought of doing his first errand for Jae Ki-young. The kid immediately dashes away. Before he can leave the gym, Jae Ki-young tells him not to go to just any coffee shop, and that he should go to Cafe TK, which is 3 whole bus stops away from the gym. Jae Ki-young insists on it and reminds Potato that he'll even check it. As Jae Ki-young retreats back inside the room, he tells Potato to take his time. Innocent little Potato, of course, didn't even think anything is amiss. He even thinks that Jae Ki-young is being so thoughtful when he tells him to take his time. And so, Potato internally promises Jae Ki-young that he'll complete his air run as fast as he can instead. Poor kid, so who's gonna tell him the truth? Anyways, back inside the room, Jae Ki-young smirks at Dan. After getting rid of the pest, Kui Potato, Dan has no more excuse to refuse at all. And so, the action is on. With Dan on all fours on the couch, they're going at it hard. As Dan realizes how he's become sensitive since the last time they did it, Jae Ki-young also realizes how it's easier to get Dan in the mood now. Jae Ki-young turns Dan over so that they're facing each other so as to avoid ruining the back of the couch. In the middle of the rodeo, Jae Ki-young's phone suddenly vibrated, forcing them to pause. The call is from Potato, asking him what kind of coffee he wants to have since he didn't mention it earlier. Understandably, Jae Ki-young is annoyed and tells Potato there's no need to call for that and to just get whatever kind. Potato, of course, insists, fearing that he might get something that Jae Ki-young doesn't like. Jae Ki-young is just about to start ranting again when he sees the trembling Dan trying hard to hold back his voice. He smirks as an idea starts formulating in his head. He gestures for Dan to keep quiet as he instructs Potato to read the whole menu. And as Potato did, Jae Ki-young is also getting very busy doing Dan, making it harder and harder for Dan to hold back his voice. Dan asks Jae Ki-young to hang up, but the hot jerk is having so much fun that there's no way he'd consider it. And as if to add to Dan's misery, Potato also asks what the doctor would want. Of course, Jae Ki-young is kind enough to put Dan on the phone so he can say what he wants himself. What a tease. A very, very hot tease. Dan tries to refuse, but Jae Ki-young isn't giving him much choice, not to mention a break. Our baby eventually managed to gasp out to just get in whatever kind of coffee. And when Potato asks again what Jae Ki-young wants, his Hee-young just curtly tells him to an iced Americano and then hangs up. Potato wonders why Jae Ki-young even made him read out the entire menu and he'll just get the simple blend. Well, you're too young to hear the reason, so just do your errand. Anyways, despite his Hee-young's unreasonable actions, Potato is still very optimistic, excited even for having to talk that long on the phone with his idol. Back at the gym, Dan calls out Jae Ki-young for suddenly putting him on the phone, to which the cruel hottie says that it's simply because he finds it fun. Jae Ki-young then tells to open his mouth and kisses him right after. Dan is done for, and shortly after, Jae Ki-young follows suit. He even went ahead and sprayed Dan with his tartar sauce, all the while commenting on how they're going to need a new couch now. It's nearing sunset when Potato got back. He came upon Dan wiping the couch from ahem, you know. Anyways, Dan informs Potato that Jae Ki-young is washing up. And just as the doctor is about to get up from the couch to take his share of the coffee, he fell from his legs, losing strength. The surprised Potato instead just went to Dan to hand the coffee. The kids wonder why Dan suddenly looks like he's sick with his face flushed. A thought suddenly pops up in his head, which he immediately dismisses, even though he's probably right. This time, it's him whose face has turned red, and so Potato excuses himself to wash his face. That night, Potato is back in front of the break room door and hears some hushed whisperings from inside. He then opens the door, looking for Jae Ki-young, only to see Dan on the couch with Jae Ki-young under him as they make out. Dan then grins at Potato as he asks him if he's a perv for spying on them. As if that isn't enough of a surprise, Dan declares Jae Ki-young is his. And that's when Potato suddenly wakes up from his dream or nightmare. He had screamed so loud as he did because Daehyun, who he's sharing the team dormitory's room, is woken up by his sudden outburst. Daehyun's complaints didn't register as Potato just cringes on the fact that he had dreamt such a thing. The next day, Potato arrives at the gym with dark circles under his eyes. He couldn't return back to sleep after waking up from his dream. Not only did he look like a mess, but Potato also kept on making mistakes in his part-time job. When he enters the gym, he sees Dan mopping the floor, which pisses him off for some reason. Potato walks up to Dan as he complains about Dan doing the job that he's supposed to do as the gym's youngest member. Dan didn't really mean anything by it, and is just trying to help he got in earlier. But Potato can't be reasoned with, especially since he doesn't know why he's getting mad, either. Later that day, in the afternoon training, the coaches are away, so Jae Ki-young is in charge. They are doing jiu-jitsu that afternoon, and as everyone gets on with the training in pairs, Potato comes up to Daehyun to let him know that he doesn't have a partner to spar with. Realizing that the members are in an odd number today, Daehyun tells Potato to do the bag for now and that he'll let him join later. Potato is just about to start on the bag when he notices Dan punching the air and asks him what he's up to. Dan then explains that he's just trying some moves himself to help better oversee Jae Ki-young's condition. Potato scolds him for trying to do it by himself when there's a lot of athletes in the gym. Dan can even ask Jae Ki-young for help too. In Dan's defense, there's no way the star athlete has time to spend with someone like him. Plus, all the other athletes are already busy as is. Feeling guilty for getting jealous over Dan, Potato offers to help him practice, although it has to be jiu-jitsu since that's what they're doing for today. It works best for Dan, too, since they're probably in the same weight class as well. Baby Dan excitedly and gratefully agrees, seeing as he's meaning to learn jiu-jitsu as well. And so Potato begins his crash course on jiu-jitsu, showing Dan different moves like the shrimp, kimura lock, and back choke. As he did, he looks over to the commotion involving Jae Ki-young and another member performing the same move. He once again starts relieving his jealousy over Dan for being close to Jae Ki-young, saying that if he's in the same position, then he would have asked Jae Ki-young to teach him. When Dan asks what he meant by that, Potato explains that Jae Ki-young won't even hold his mitts for him. This confession makes Dan realize that in Potato's head, he and Jae Ki-young are close, although they really are in a way, and Potato is envious of this closeness, even though he really shouldn't. Suddenly getting distracted by his own thoughts, Potato unintentionally squeezes his hold of Dan a little too tight for comfort. He only realizes this mistake when Dan is already struggling to breathe. Now the commotion is in their side. Daehyun and the others were quick to notice this and scolds Potato for being careless. After all, Dan could pass out, not to mention he's not an athlete in the first place. Dan tries to assure them that he's alright amidst the coughing and gasping for air. And of course, Jae Ki-young chose that exact time to approach them and ask what's the fuss about. Potato panicked, thinking that he's really in trouble now. Dan tries to make it seem that it's his fault for wanting to learn jiu-jitsu and asking Potato for assistance. Jae Ki-young asks him why he's trying to learn it. Dan then explains, while blushing on his own, that he just wants to familiarize himself with the sport that his main client is practicing. Feeling good that baby Dan is doing it for him, Jae Ki-young grins and tells Dan that he'll show it to him himself instead. He gestures for Dan to enter the ring so he can show it to him properly through a spar. Everyone is horrified at his declaration. I mean, who wouldn't? Mostly the athletes, since Dan is really just surprised. Anyways, Daehyun exclaims that Jae Ki-young might as well kill Dan if they go through with it. But Jae Ki-young says that it's just a spar and Dan can just wear a full safety gear. Of course, there's no way that's enough. And the other member starts accusing Jae Ki-young of taking advantage of the situation since the coaches are not present. Not that they can really do anything about it. After all, Jae Ki-young is still in charge right now. Daejeon tries to convince Dan to decline. After all, Jae Ki-young still hurts his sparring partner hard, even when he's going easy. And that's coming from a true blue athlete. But see, baby, Dan is determined to do it despite being scared himself, surprising everyone. After all, Dan is also curious about sparring. And that was when Potato suddenly bursts out asking Jae Ki-young why he wouldn't spar with him when it's his dream to spar with his idol. Instead of answering, though, the idol just ignores his little fan. While the others start assisting Dan by giving him the gears, Dan can't help feeling bad for the disheartened Potato. And so, not long after Team Black's match of the century begins. Despite Daejeon's insistence for the match cancellation previously, he's still so game on being the MC for the special match happening at the Team Black gym. First off, Daejeon introduces the hottest and handsomest in all of his yumminess glory, not to mention the man who got blacklisted in an arcade for breaking their punching machine time and again, the one and only champion, the Emperor Jae Ki-young. As for the challenger, the Black team's shooting star, the healer with a magic touch, and the underdog super rookie Gok Dan. And so, that marks the beginning of the most ridiculously unfair match of all time. Cheering is everywhere in the crowd, all mockingly rooting for baby Dan, with the exception of the still very upset Potato. Anyways, before the match officially begins, Jae Ki-young declares that as long as Dan manages to hit his face in the 3 minutes over 3 rounds, then Dan wins. Daejeon asks Jae Ki-young if he's sure about that handicap, which the star athlete confidently confirms, instigating Dan to just land a punch on him like he did before in the shower room. Although Jae Ki-young declares that it won't be easy this time, so it'll be virtually impossible. The audience believes otherwise, however, being the loyal Dan fans that they are. Despite everyone's shenanigans, Dan is being very earnest and asks Jae Ki-young what will happen if he actually wins. Jae Ki-young is very mocking at first, so full of himself. Then again, just to humor Dan, he promises to grant him a wish if he wins. Dan looks at this opportunity favorably. Shortly after, the match begins. Dan's heart is thumping loudly as the audience voices out their support. Jae Ki-young makes the first move with a punch in the torso, which Dan had no chance of dodging despite the kind warning. And just like that, Dan is down, and the audience is horrified. The booing from the audience is deafening as they criticize the champion for not being gentle and doing foul play by being unsportsmanly. In Jae Ki-young's defense, he was being gentle, and the only reason why Dan fell was because he's so light. Daejeon asks Dan if he's alright as he helps him up and suggests that maybe they should just stop now. But Dan insists on continuing, saying that he was just caught off guard. Jae Ki-young welcomes this, saying that it wouldn't be fun if Dan gives up with just that. Despite his strong front, Dan is nervous and conflicted. He has no idea how to actually land a hit on Jae Ki-young now that it's expected of him to do so. After all, the star athlete is so intimidating in his eyes that he can barely breathe. Since Dan isn't making a move to hit him, Jae Ki-young once again takes the initiative to attack. And so continued punches are thrown toward the challenger, not to mention the mocking words from the champion himself. Dan feels the weight of each punch that, even though he's wearing the headgear, he's starting to feel dizzy already. All the while, Jae Ki-young still tries to gouge some fighting spirit from him and even reminds him of the goons who were after him. It seems that it did the trick because Dan actually starts to fight back by throwing his own punches. Although, of course, actually landing one is a different story. Despite Dan's struggles, his attack still ended with Jae Ki-young landing yet another punch in his face. At this point, even the audience can see that Jae Ki-young looks like he's just toying with a kid. They were saying how it was a good thing that Jae Ki-young found sports instead of losing his way. After all, he had the personality to match a darker path. Meanwhile, Jae Ki-young tackles Dan and mocks him for letting himself be overpowered even in the ring. He even starts pressing on Dan's torso with his knees and telling him that if it were the others doing that to Dan, then it'll be game over in an instant. Since Jae Ki-young is being too much, Daejeon himself calls for a timeout for Dan's sake, fearing that Jae Ki-young might actually break his ribs if he doesn't back up. Once Dan manages to get up, his nose starts bleeding, and yet he still insists on continuing. The match then advances to the final minute, and the crowd's cheering is still loud and clear in favor of their favorite doctor. Once again, Jae Ki-young encourages and mocks Dan at the same time to attack him. The swaying and trembling Dan tries his best, although it's nowhere near acceptable. The outcome is so obvious that some of the audience are already starting to lose hope. Even Potato is starting to get confused at the reasons behind Dan and Jae Ki-young's actions. He just doesn't understand if the two of them are actually on good terms or not. Just as Jae Ki-young decides to finally end the match, Dan went for a clinch. This way, Jae Ki-young won't be able to hit him since he's hugging him like that. All the fanboy Potato could think, however, is him wanting to hug Jae Ki-young himself. Okay, this kid is starting to get really creepy right now. Back at the ring, Dan is almost at his limit, and just as the annoyed Jae Ki-young pushes him away, the door to the gym entrance opens, revealing the coaches who come back with a feast in their arms for everyone. The entrance caught everyone's attention, even Jae Ki-young's. Dan didn't miss this opportunity and actually managed to throw another punch on Jae Ki-young's face, surprising everyone just in time for the bell to ring as well. And just like that, Dan actually managed to win the match, amidst the cheering from the audience. This time, it's Dan's turn to mock Jae Ki-young by throwing his words back at him for letting his guard down. Sekisei, our champion, is speechless. That said, Dan brings up the wish that Jae Ki-young promised. Jae Ki-young isn't going back on his words and even assumes that Dan wants to ask for more money again. But contrary to everyone's expectations, Dan wishes for Jae Ki-young to spar with Potato once. And with that, the match officially ends with Dan thanking Jae Ki-young for his time. Potato flushed, realizing that Dan did that for him after he mentioned how Jae Ki-young wouldn't even hold his mitts for him. Potato's sunbaes congratulated him, seeing as it was his dream to spar with his idol. And Dan just gave him that opportunity. Jae Ki-young isn't really thrilled to hear that. Then again, he still tells Potato to be ready by next week. Dan smiles at Potato as the youngster gives a resounding yes sir to Jae Ki-young. And just like that, Dan finally managed to have everyone's heart. Potato even considers Dan an angel now. What a simple-minded kid. Seriously, where did your perceptiveness go? Anyways, a sobbing and very grateful Potato gives Dan a hug as he apologizes to the doctor for being hostile this whole time. Not that Dan really minded or noticed in the first place. Although Jae Ki-young sees the drama as ridiculous, he still applauds Dan for having the guts. Not that he's going to say that out loud. Oh, and if anyone is wondering, Jae Ki-young did manage to get scolded by Coach Teddy Bear for sparring with Dan. At the hospital, Jae Ki-young is doing various tests I'm pretty sure all athletes routinely do. After that, he and Dan went to the consultation room to go over the results with the doctor in charge. Makes an excuse that he's just being considerate about Jae Ki-young's busy schedule, but really just doesn't want to deal with the drama that is Jae Ki-young himself. The doctor shows the star athlete to his rehab session and claims to just discuss the results with Dan. Jae Ki-young warns Dr. Lee not to say anything weird without him there. The doctor promises, but it's not like Jae Ki-young mentioned the specifics of what qualifies as weird. Anyways, now that it's just the two of them left, Dr. Lee asks Dan if he has already looked over Jae Ki-young's files, which he already did, and it's precisely because of this that he wants to confirm with the doctor if his conclusions were right. That's to say that Jae Ki-young is overexerting himself. His joints are strained, and his shoulder is in bad shape. Strictly speaking, the only reason why Jae Ki-young is still doing well despite all of it is because of Dan's treatments. Although it's true that it's normal for athletes to deal with injuries from time to time, Jae Ki-young is just being so harsh with his body that there's a higher risk for him to get newer ones again and again. Whether Jae Ki-young is just determined to maintain what he has obtained so far or because of something else, he uses it as his fuel to function through the pain he's definitely feeling. At the doctor's words, Dan realizes that even though Jae Ki-young said he was lying when he said his shoulder hurt at his last match, the truth is he probably isn't. The doctor asks if Jae Ki-young still doesn't take a day off, to which Dan confirms. After all, even on the days when he's not training, Jae Ki-young had off-site celebrity stuff appointments. Anyways, the doctor really wants to have Jae Ki-young take a week off, but since that would be impossible, he compromises with at least just a day or two. Dr. Lee also tells Dan to remind Jae Ki-young that they're doing it to secure his career for a longer time since he's a champion and all. After the consultation is over, Dan heads to where Jae Ki-young is. On the way, he wonders why the star athlete pushes himself so hard. It's a given that he would be competitive, as most athletes are, if not all. But Jae Ki-young also has that jinx to worry about, so there's more toll on him. Later that day, back at the gym, Dan is discussing the doctor's advice with the head coach, and so Dan asks the coach to leave a full day off each week for Jae Ki-young to rest. For starters, he wants his entire schedule to be emptied on the coming Saturday. The coach promises to work it out with the agency, although the real issue would be convincing Jae Ki-young to actually agree with it, since apparently day off is not included in his vocabulary. Then again, the coach teddy bear is somehow optimistic that Jae Ki-young might actually listen to Dan this time. Even later that day, when Dan is giving Jae Ki-young his treatment and mentions the new arrangements, the reaction Jae Ki-young had is as expected, glaring and all. Of course, Jae Ki-young blames the Dr. Lee for it, refusing to listen. After all, to him, time is precious and should be used in training instead of resting. But Dan insists, saying that it's not just because Dr. Lee suggested it that they're doing it, because Dan himself also believes Jae Ki-young needs the rest. Okay, let's pause here a bit and just admire how handsome Jae Ki-young is in this side view of his. Okay, done. Moving on. Dan tries to plead with the very stubborn Jae Ki-young, who thinks resting is pointless and training is the best. It seemed impossible to convince him otherwise. That is until Dan promises to come up with activities for Jae Ki-young to do. In fact, Dan would also stay with Jae Ki-young all day if he wants. Jae Ki-young, being the perv that he is, has other ideas about what the two of them would do resting and even touches Dan's buns to make a point. The blushing Dan insists that there are other things they could do instead of playing rodeo. There's also the option of Dan leaving the house if Jae Ki-young prefers it that way. But see, Jae Ki-young is already curious as to what activities Dan will come up with. Plus, it's Dan who's making him rest, so Dan has to see it through to the end. Although he's having his own doubts, Dan agrees. Later in the evening, Dan spends overtime looking for activities on the internet. After all, Dan is also someone who doesn't really do day offs either. And on top of that, he has to cater to Jae Ki-young's preferences, which he has no idea about. Not long after, Saturday came, and as promised, Jae Ki-young is having the day off. After staying up all night, what Dan managed to come up with are various board games. Although Dan is also willing to cancel it to do rehab stretches or meditation, all of which are things Jae Ki-young are not keen to doing. Anyways, before they start, Dan admits that he had never played any board games before, so he only looked at the rules earlier. He's obviously implying that Jae Ki-young looks at them too, but Jae Ki-young is confident he doesn't need to and claims that he should be able to win against Dan. But see, in every board game they play, Jae Ki-young just can't seem to win against Dan. Even Monopoly is no different. It comes to the point that Jae Ki-young is convinced Dan is doing everything on purpose just so he can win against Jae Ki-young on something. That isn't Dan's purpose at all, although it does feel good besting the dude on something. Anyways, as ridiculous as it may sound, the last straw for Jae Ki-young is having to pay a high toll when he already has no money. And so, being the sore loser that he is, Jae Ki-young angrily leaves Dan by himself in the living room, declaring that he's done with board games for the day. Dan manages to catch up with Jae Ki-young in the pool area, where he's just leisurely floating and trying to enjoy the water. Dan then asks Jae Ki-young if he likes swimming, to which the athlete confirms. In fact, that's the reason why he bought the place. Anyways, Dan decided to stay at the edge on the pool if only to make sure Jae Ki-young doesn't pushes himself too hard. When Jae Ki-young asks why he's just sitting there, Dan admits that he doesn't know how to swim, so he'll just watch him. Grinning mischievously, Jae Ki-young grabs Dan's leg, pulling him into the water, claiming that Dan should take the opportunity to learn it today. Dan panics when he falls into the water, splashing like an idiot, claiming that he can't reach the bottom and asking for help. That is until Jae Ki-young patiently holds Dan in place and tells him that the pool's less than 5 feet deep, so there's no way Dan can't reach the bottom. Once he gets over his panic, it's safe to say that Dan is very much embarrassed. Once upon a time, rather way too many times, your witty narrator was also in the very much the same situation. And let me tell you, doing that in public is 10 times more embarrassing. Moving on, Dan just didn't say anything and instead returns to his place by the edge of the pool. As the now very much dripping wet Dan tries to wipe himself dry with a towel, Jae Ki-young just observes him. Without warning, Jae Ki-young suddenly comes out of the water right in front of Dan and catches him off guard. Grinning, Jae Ki-young tells Dan how it's too bad that they can't really play rough on his day off. Although, of course, that's just the password for actually playing it rough in the end. The makeout session by the poolside begins, complete with their eyes close and whatnots, after which Jae Ki-young frees his eggplant and orders Dan to savor it. After all, Dan promised him to have a good day off, and since he's too lazy to do the prepping himself, he also tells Dan to do it himself. Not long after, they were actually at it already, and although Dan tries his best to cater to Jae Ki-young's demands, Jae Ki-young is still unsatisfied with the service, nor the condition of Dan's black hole he wanted to be prepped. Thus, in the end, Jae Ki-young still ended up doing it himself. After all, if he leaves Dan to his own devices, the day would end without them actually doing the deed. Once Jae Ki-young determines that Dan is ready, he pulls the doctor to sit on top of him by the deck chair. After this, he orders Dan to actually initiate the deed. Dan is, of course, hesitant, but Jae Ki-young insists, claiming that Dan should do it this time since Jae Ki-young has always done all the work before. Owing to the fact that Dan is bad at it, it's super humiliating on Dan's end, but after Jae Ki-young stares at him intensely, Dan feels like giving in. To save himself from further embarrassment, Dan asks what he can do while turning away from Jae Ki-young. Then again, a star athlete really doesn't care about his position as long as he's doing something. Dan is having a hard time eating the eggplant. It's too big, and it's hurting him so much. Losing his patience, Jae Ki-young once again helps Dan go through with it in one go, all at Dan's expense. But see, it really is just too much for Dan that he suddenly pulls himself away from Jae Ki-young and wants to take just a minute break. This doesn't sit well with Jae Ki-young, and gets annoyed that Dan broke the flow even though he had already told him not to. Without warning, Jae Ki-young carries Dan to the pool and starts doing it while there. That way, it'll be harder for Dan to do whatever he wants since he's afraid of the water. Dan feels strange, especially with the water also getting inside. He asks Jae Ki-young to leave the pool, but instead, Jae Ki-young just pushes him under the water. As a result, Dan holds Jae Ki-young's shoulder for dear life. Even when Dan starts weeping, Jae Ki-young isn't moved. In fact, he pats himself on the back, seeing as Dan is now really holding on to the Jae Ki-young, not wanting to fall into the water again. As the actions go on under the water, some actions are also happening with their mouths. Not long after, the both of them finish, with Dan feeling dizzy and eventually losing consciousness soon after. Dan is convinced that the longer the time passes, the less controlled he has over his body and feelings, which he just can't afford to let happen, even though it's already happening. Dan wakes up in the middle of the night in Jae Ki-young's room. Although he's left in his birth suit, at least Jae Ki-young is nice enough to carry him there and cover him properly with a blanket. Dan reflects on the fact that he had passed out again while they were doing it, and even woke up when the city lights are already sparkling brightly. Then again, he was also already tired from staying up late, so it was understandable. And even though he's already moaning from his throbbing back pain, he's more concerned about the whereabouts of the culprit. After getting dressed, Dan wanders around, wondering if Jae Ki-young has already gone to bed himself. Only he didn't. Jae Ki-young is actually in his room's attached living room watching TV, looking all drool-worthy hot in a pair of glasses and exposed yummalicious abs. Even Dan blushes at the sight. Jae Ki-young is quick to notice him, of course, and comments on how Dan was dead to the world earlier. Dan apologizes and asks Jae Ki-young about his dinner, which he already had. Once again, Dan apologizes, although it's not like Jae Ki-young really minded. Soon after, Dan stands at the back of the sofa that Jae Ki-young is occupying to himself and realizes that Jae Ki-young is actually watching a black and white movie. Baby Dan is so timid that he still has to wait for Jae Ki-young to tell him to sit before actually doing so, as if the sofa is not long enough to fit at least 3 laying adults. And so, the two of them watch the movie in silence, with Dan feeling so awkward since it's the first time that he's doing this with Jae Ki-young. Anyways, it's still technically Jae Ki-young's day off, and they're simply having a movie night. Although black and white is a bit outdated, it's a personal preference. Anyways, Dan finds himself once again thinking about how the glasses suit Jae Ki-young as with the rest of us. But before he can start thinking about something else altogether, he distracts himself by asking Jae Ki-young if he likes movies. Jae Ki-young admits that he just watches them when he can't sleep. And that's when Dan discovers that Jae Ki-young has trouble sleeping. Dan then asks if he already went to see a doctor, but Jae Ki-young thinks it's just a waste of time. And it's not like he can drink sleeping pills either since it messes up his drug tests before matches. He did try to look for alternatives and found out that watching old movies works best. Well, movies and doing the rumpy-pumpy, actually. But since doing the latter is too much work, he's just left with the movies, and once again comments on how privileged Dan is for being such a good sleeper. That said, now Dan realizes that Jae Ki-young wasn't just being a jerk when he told Dan he should be careful with the noise he's making when he's sleeping during that time when he started living there. He may not look like it, but it's a fact that Jae Ki-young is actually getting even less rest. And yet here we are, in all our potato-ness glory. Even though we sleep 8 to 10 hours a day, where's the justice in that? Injustices aside, Dan voices out his concern about Jae Ki-young feeling exhausted when he's not getting enough sleep or having days off. For Jae Ki-young, however, exhaustion isn't important when you want to stay on top. With new challengers always on the lookout for opportunities to take him down, of course, he can't just take it easy. For Jae Ki-young, relaxing means losing. Thus, it's better to make use of that time to train instead. And so, Jae Ki-young tells Dan not to insist too much on that once-a-week day off. With that reasoning laid out, of course, Dan has no choice but to concede. By the way, did you also realize that by Jae Ki-young's standards, all of us who want to take a day off every day and sleep at least 8 hours a day are considered losers? Anyways, in the end, it's really all about winning for Jae Ki-young. For him, just a single loss means giving up on being a champion altogether. Although it's admirable that Jae Ki-young is really a hard worker, the fact is that sooner or later, something will give in. And if that happens, it's going to be ugly. How is Dan even going to help Jae Ki-young when that time comes? While Dan is deep in his thoughts about Jae Ki-young's possible future, the man himself suddenly asks him why he used his wish for Potato instead of for himself. Dan explains that it's because he saw how disappointed Potato was when he couldn't train with Jae Ki-young, plus the fact that he's a hardworking kid. Instead of getting praised for his inability, Jae Ki-young scolds Dan for looking out for others when he can't even look after himself. That said, Jae Ki-young then asks what Dan would have wished for himself if Potato wasn't around. Dan tries to deny wanting anything, but of course, Jae Ki-young doesn't believe him. After all, even earlier, Dan has a lot of things he's whining about when they were doing it by the pool. And so, once again, Jae Ki-young asks him what he wants, hinting that he would grant to. After much hesitation, Dan finally voices his wish, which was for Jae Ki-young to start using rubber when they're doing it. Jae Ki-young strongly reacts to it and tries to be funny by pointing out that it's because Dan is afraid of getting pregnant. Like, dude, come on. Seriously. Anyways, Dan explains that it's only because it's harder for him to clean after. But Jae Ki-young didn't even consider it and just flat out said no, and when Dan tries to ask why, Jae Ki-young responds that it's because it feels better doing it without one. He even starts being shamelessly graphic by detailing how good Dan's black hole feels, not to mention the sight of his tartar sauce coming out of it, all of which would be impossible if you wore a rubber. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's already a fact, but we still have to say it. Jae Ki-young is, without a doubt, a huge perv. Jae Ki-young points out that Dan is also starting to enjoy doing it as is. After all, when they first started doing it, Dan always whines and complains. But now he's so sensitive that even if Jae Ki-young just uses his fingers, Dan will probably be done already. Dan tries to deny the accusations while blushing furiously, which pisses Jae Ki-young off since it's as if Dan's calling him a liar. And so, to prove his point, Jae Ki-young pushes Dan onto the sofa and starts to take off his shirt for a little experiment on Dan's ability to hold it in. As if on cue, the movie on the screen starts playing an intimate scene, which is part of the movie's director's cut. Anyways, even though Jae Ki-young mocks it, it also gives him an idea of what to do with Dan. Without further ado, he starts playing with Dan's nip-nops, earning him a good reaction. And even though Dan claims that what Jae Ki-young's doing tickles, he also starts to arch his back. This clearly indicates that nip-nop play makes him feel good. In fact, Dan's sword is starting to get alert, and Jae Ki-young wonders if Dan would actually get off from Jae Ki-young touching his chest. Dan is definitely feeling strange with the sudden play, and he also feels like if Jae Ki-young brushes on his nip-nops again, he's going to lose it. But see, Jae Ki-young isn't that boring. Instead of just brushing it again, Jae Ki-young actually puts one of the nip-nops in his mouth and plays with it, adding his own sword rubbing against Dan's. Of course it would be too much for baby Dan. Jae Ki-young mocks Dan for finishing from just the nip-nop play, and yet he goes on and sheathes his sword on Dan's black hole. And so begins today's round 2. Dan just let Jae Ki-young do whatever he wants, all the while reflects on the fact that every part of his body that Jae Ki-young touches burns. But see, that's just the first sign of being crazy, if you get what I mean. Although Dan would rather not. Moving on to another day, we see a black RV driving on the freeway. The driver asks his passenger named Hee-sung if he's asleep, to which Hee-sung replies that he's not and asks what he's calling him for. The driver explains that Jae Ki-young is free tomorrow for a private personal training. Hee-sung wonders how come Jae Ki-young has time now, to which the driver explains how he told them he has some big action coming up and needs PT this time. For what it's worth, this Hee-sung guy seems to know Jae Ki-young well and has been wanting to meet him. He looks like a third wheel just appeared, and quite handsome too. One morning, Dan is in the bathroom brushing his teeth and is thinking about visiting Grandma in the morning and head to the gym after lunch. Suddenly, Jae Ki-young opened the door to the bathroom, and he went. Dan is taken aback by his sudden appearance and asks Jae Ki-young why he's not using the master bathroom, to which Jae Ki-young simply says that his bathroom run out of toothpaste. Dan suddenly became conscious since he's only wearing his underwear underneath his shirt. Although Jae Ki-young found his shyness ridiculous since he's already seen every nook and cranny of Dan's body, Dan felt embarrassed now that he realizes that. Soon after, the two of them started brushing their teeth in peace. Although as they did, Dan couldn't help but glance at his employer every now and then. What was in Dan's head is that, ever since that day at the pool, something had felt different. For example, Dan used to always feel on edge when he's near Jae Ki-young. And yet now it's just making his heart go thump-thump, and his face goes flush-flush. As was previously mentioned, early signs of going crazy. Later that day, when Dan arrives at the gym in the afternoon, the athletes were eating lunch. One of them hands Dan a complete course lunchbox. Dan gives his thanks and asks where it came from. It is then explained to him that it was from the actor Choi Hee-sung. And although he's the most popular actor these days, Dan did not recognize him. Ha, a comrade. Anyways, he's in their gym because he's going to have a personal training with Jae Ki-young, which is news to Dan. Jae Ki-young doesn't usually give personal training, but Choi Hee-sung is a special case. The actor usually comes by when he has an action scene to shoot and needs Jae Ki-young's help to prepare. And whenever Hee-sung does come, he often brings them treats such as the lunchboxes, which everyone enjoys. Dan is then encouraged to go to the training room and see the actor as well as Jae Ki-young. The training session is already in action when Dan arrives at the room. Coach Teddy Bear is the first to greet Dan, who then asks about the actor. The coach explains that Hee-sung comes to their gym from time to train. Dan doesn't really know the actor, although he does look familiar to him. Anyways, it seems that the only reason why Jae Ki-young makes an exception to train Hee-sung is because they are from the same agency. The agency that represents Jae Ki-young for his commercial work and TV appearances. The relationship was meant to let Jae Ki-young have someone around his age he could hang around with. But as expected, Jae Ki-young just treats the actor as a pain in the ass, which upsets the coach so much. After all, having Hee-sung come to their gym is free PR for them, not to mention the amount that he pays for the sessions. It's almost 2 in the afternoon when Jae Ki-young has had enough and finishes their session. Hee-sung didn't want to leave, but he is indeed busy and thus had no choice but to concede. Although not before taking a selfie with the two of them together. Despite Jae Ki-young hating it a lot to Hee-sung's team, it meant getting more likes for Hee-sung's vlog and other social media accounts. Meanwhile, as Dan observes the two, he couldn't help but admire how handsome they are. In fact, it's like they're becoming more attractive when they're standing right next to each other. Then again, Dan really only has Jae Ki-young in his eyes, no matter what. As the session is officially over, Hee-sung's driver from the previous chapter, who seems to have turned out to be his manager, asks Hee-sung if he has hurt his wrist. Hee-sung admits that it did feel a little sore. They wanted to have it checked out, but then they didn't really have time. Dan overhears this and volunteers himself to take a look at it. Dan walks over to them and introduces himself as Jae Ki-young's personal physical therapist. Hee-sung didn't say anything and just let Dan examine him, all the while just staring at Dan blankly. And by the time Dan advises Hee-sung to ice and rest his wrist when he gets home, Dan is already shining in the actor's eyes. In short, it's love at first sight. Baby Dan is keeping it all professional, but Hee-sung didn't even waste time to make his move. He comes strong, calling Dan an angel, and then straight up asks for his name and therefore formally introduces themselves to each other. Getting up close with the actor, Dan realizes something and asks him if he had been in the weekend drama called A Fine Line. When Hee-sung confirms this, Dan gets excited. After all, it was a drama that he used to watch with Grandma, who is, in fact, a huge fan of Hee-sung's as well. Grandma likes her men handsome. Anyways, not missing the momentum, Hee-sung once again tries to make a move on Dan, praising him and telling him how he's looking forward to seeing him in his next session. Hee-sung's manager knows exactly what he's doing, although Dan just finds the actor's enthusiasm and attention awkward. As Hee-sung continues to bother Dan with 20 questions, good old Jae Ki-young just watches them with one eyebrow raised. One another fine day at the gym, Hee-sung suddenly appears, bearing a luxurious gift. Dan tries to refuse, but Hee-sung insists, saying that it's his thanks for Dan's previous help with his wrist. When Dan voices out his hesitance, Hee-sung brought out t-shirts that were meant for the other team members. It was no big deal for him since he models for the brand. The only one who suffers is Mr. Manager, who has the responsibility of bringing the shirts over. Moving forward, it seems that the actor Choi Hee-sung had been going to the gym every day, even on the days when he didn't have any training sessions with Jae Ki-young. And each day that he does, he would always bring gifts with him. Luxurious shoes, supplements, electronics, and even a coffee truck are all for Dan. And today, Hee-sung even brought him a bouquet of pink flowers. As Hee-sung gives them flowers to Dan, he pairs it up with a cringy line of how he saw those on his way to the gym and just knew that it'll suit Dan well. Once again, Dan just feels awkward at the attention that he's receiving from the actor. And when Dan tells him that there is no need for him to go to the gym at such an hour, Hee-sung insists that he has plenty of time to mess around. In fact, the other team members welcomes Hee-sung so much, all thanks to the gifts and treats they're receiving from him. Dan is starting to feel really burdened with a growing pile of gifts and wants to do something for Hee-sung to return the favor. After all those gifts, not to mention the flowers, definitely look expensive. Wanting to make things clear, Dan goes to confront Hee-sung, asking him the reason behind those gifts. Of what exactly does the actor want from Dan? The inquiry surprised Hee-sung, probably in awe of the fact that Dan is so oblivious and innocent of this kind of thing. And so, Hee-sung made it clear to him that he wants to get closer to Dan, and that everyone would want to give gifts to the person they like, wouldn't they? So, does that mean no one likes me because I ain't receiving any gift for me? This dude is just the actor version of Jae Ki-young, isn't he? Anyways, at least now it is already made clear to Dan that Hee-sung likes him. The poor manager then arrives, begging Hee-sung to leave since they're going to be late for his next appointment. Hee-sung bids farewell to Dan, promising to see him again the next day. On Hee-sung's way out, he bumps into Potato, whom he immediately thinks of as an ugly little mutt. Well, Dan did see Potato as a puppy previously. While the other team members feel grateful to Dan for spending less money on food because of Hee-sung's gifts to him, the same sentiment can't be said for Potato. With a serious expression on his face, Potato expresses his suspicions about the actor, pointing out that the dude has some ulterior motives for showing Dan with gifts, and that the actor is actually hiding some dark side of some sort. And since we have already established Potato's perceptiveness, we can be certain that this is a fact despite what the other members say. Anyways, Potato is just saying that for Dan's sake. After all, Dan is just too good for the dude. Even after all that, Dan still has some self-doubts about someone as accomplished as Hee-sung pursuing him like this. Dan is in the middle of this reflection when Jae Ki-young calls him over to leave for the night. Later that evening, while they were in the elevator on the way to their floor, Dan reflects on the fact that he should not have brought the flowers home since it feels somehow embarrassing. Then again, they were so beautiful that it just felt wrong to let the flowers wilt. That aside, Dan feels like Jae Ki-young is not in the mood, even though the dude isn't saying or doing anything. As an icebreaker, Dan asks Jae Ki-young if he likes flowers and goes on to share how he likes their smell. Before Dan could say any more though, Jae Ki-young nonchalantly states that he hates flowers. And with that, the one-sided conversation ended. The following day, Hee-sung is once again back at the gym, although this time he actually had a session with Jae Ki-young. The actor sparkles as he sees Dan, try as he might to woo the unwooable. Despite Dan's distance, Hee-sung doesn't look like he's going to give up just yet. In fact, he went on and asked for Dan to treat him as well. Held such shamelessness. Anyways, Dan doesn't think his service is necessary, but Hee-sung insists. After all, he's going to shoot a lot of action scenes but doesn't have time to go to the hospital for checkups and whatnot. Plus, he would also like to experience Dan's magic touch as well. Dan didn't even manage to give his answer though, as Jae Ki-young comes up behind him and answers for Dan instead, explaining that Dan is already busy with Jae Ki-young. With not even so much as a hi, Jae Ki-young then proceeds to scold Dan for loitering around when he should have started preparing for the day. As for Hee-sung, Jae Ki-young is being sarcastic with him for having so much free time and being so popular in the gym, and instructing him to go to the training room once he's ready. Jae Ki-young didn't even wait for a reply and once again went to scold Dan. They were already a little far away when Jae Ki-young tells Dan to turn off his alarm faster in the morning since he can hear the noise all the way to his room. As Dan flushes, apologizing for this mishap, Hee-sung, who had been listening to this whole time, put two and two together and realized that the employee and employer are actually living together. With a glint of mischief in his eyes, it looks like the dark side that Potato perceived is actually surfacing already. Later on in the training room, as the session is about to start, Hee-sung comes up to Jae Ki-young and asks him for a sparring session. Mr. Manager is quick to dissuade it. After all, Didn't Hee-sung already promise to not do his sparring sessions owing to the fact that he might get hit in the face? But Hee-sung insists. Not only does he have a fight scene coming up, but it could also show them how much he has actually learned so far. Hee-sung is obviously up to something which Jae Ki-young may or may not have an inkling about. Nevertheless, Jae Ki-young agrees. And soon after, the spar begins. Both Mr. Manager and Coach Teddy Bear didn't cut short on reminding them to be careful. After experiencing almost getting hit by Jae Ki-young's fast fist, Hee-sung proceeds to tackle and attack Jae Ki-young. But it seems that something had gone wrong in the process because the Jae Ki-young, who was caught off guard, didn't try to absorb the attack as was expected of him too. Instead, he blocks it, which results in Hee-sung being unable to move his back somehow. Dan is immediately called to check on Hee-sung, who suggests that they bring him to the hospital since, according to him, it's really hard to move. Anyways, Hee-sung even starts saying how his back hurts so much that he thinks he might better off skip filming tomorrow. This statement sent Mr. Manager into panic and even starts getting angry at Jae Ki-young for going along with the spar, pointing out how none of them gets paid if Hee-sung can't work, even though it's Hee-sung himself who asked for it in the first place. As if Jae Ki-young actually needs the money Hee-sung is paying him. The dude's plenty rich enough. They should just be thankful that Jae Ki-young is even sparing him time for the sessions only Hee-sung obviously needs. Anyways, with Jae Ki-young's temper, of course, he's just about to match the hostility directed to him. If it weren't for his coach pulling in the reins and forcing Jae Ki-young to apologize instead and even offering to pay Hee-sung's medical bills. Hee-sung turns it down. After all, he's also partly to be blamed for wanting to spar in the first place. Instead, he asks for some regular sessions with Dan. Wait, what? No. Am I right to think that this was all a ploy? Ha, actors. Am I right? Despite the fishiness of it all, in the end, an arrangement was made where, in return for Hee-sung not pressing charges, he'd receive regular treatments from Dan. This leads them to today, where it's the weekend, and Dan's off to see Hee-sung for his treatment. Dan bids farewell to Jae Ki-young, although the latter didn't even spare him a glance as he did. Dan believes that Jae Ki-young is acting like that because he's upset himself since his miscalculations almost got the whole team into trouble. Dan is just grateful that they managed to resolve it with only him providing his services, which he'll willingly give. After all, it's all for Jae Ki-young's sake. Anyways, Dan just exited the building when Hee-sung appears with his car and calls out for Dan from inside. Dan is surprised that Hee-sung even knows where he'd be, to which Hee-sung responds that it's because Dan lives with Jae Ki-young in the building where Hee-sung himself used to live. As Dan gets in the car, he worriedly asks Hee-sung about his back. Hee-sung says that he's taking painkillers, so it doesn't hurt as bad. And then he tells Dan that there's some place he wants to drop by before they start the treatment. And since it's the weekend, there's something that he wants to do for Dan. And that something seems to be shopping luxurious stuff once again for baby Dan. As the two of them move from shop to shop, Dan can't help but feel guilty for Hee-sung spending so much for him already. He also reflects on the fact that the world is full of expensive things for those who can afford them. Not that Dan feels any of that stuff suits him. In fact, instead of him, it would suit Jae Ki-young perfectly. Just like the set of suits he sees on display, which Dan believes would definitely look amazing on Jae Ki-young. Finding an opportunity, Dan tells Hee-sung that they should head back and start the treatment. But then Hee-sung suggests that since it's getting late, they should first eat something instead. And so the two of them ended up eating in a high-class restaurant, seeing as Hee-sung had already spent so much for him. Dan wanted to at least pay for their lunch, although he had no choice but to take back his offer after Hee-sung said that the place costs $200 a plate. By the way, that smiling face is really starting to get on my nerves. Anyways, as the two of them start eating, Hee-sung asks Dan if he enjoys working with Jae Ki-young. Although hesitant, Dan responds that he does. It seems that after Hee-sung heard about Dan living together with Jae Ki-young, he thought that it was because Dan had so much work to do that he needs to be around Jae Ki-young every day, every week. If doing it with Jae Ki-young counts as work, then that is indeed the case. But it's not like he can just flat out say that. Instead, Dan explains briefly how Jae Ki-young was kind enough to let Dan live with him after he suddenly had to move out of his place. Hee-sung then admits that he's just curious because he had never heard of Jae Ki-young taking in a roommate before. Dan isn't really making a big deal out of it though. After all, he was really just brought in to take care of Jae Ki-young's overall condition. This statement leads to Hee-sung realizing that there really is indeed something going on between Dan and Jae Ki-young. As it turns out, Hee-sung is also aware of the star athlete's jinx. Not that it really matters. Anyways, Dan's phone suddenly started vibrating, It's a call from Jae Ki-young. And so, Dan excuses himself to take it. Jae Ki-young tells Dan that he's home and that Dan should head back and give him his treatment. When Dan tries to explain that he's yet to give Hee-sung his treatment, Jae Ki-young suddenly gets angry and just demands that he return home immediately before hanging up. After the call, Dan is in a dilemma when he explains the situation to Hee-sung. Hee-sung is generous enough to let Dan give treatment to Jae Ki-young first, and that they can do the treatment for him after an hour or two at Hee-sung's place. Dan is hesitant, but of course, Jae Ki-young is still the priority in the end. Not long after, Dan leaves the restaurant promising Hee-sung to be back as soon as he can. But see, Hee-sung already knows that it was all Jae Ki-young's trick. When Dan finally gets back home, he apologizes to Jae Ki-young as soon as he arrives and asks him if he's in a lot of discomfort. What Dan came upon, however, is Jae Ki-young relaxing in his bed. Jae Ki-young just stares at Dan and didn't say anything, which made Dan think that perhaps he's still angry. On the bright side, Dan is just thankful that Jae Ki-young doesn't look like he's in pain. The treatment lasted almost 2 hours, and it seems like this whole time Jae Ki-young still didn't say anything. Anyways, right after treating Jae Ki-young, Dan had to head out again since he's yet to give Hee-sung his. Just as Dan's about to head out, Jae Ki-young calls after him and offers him a ride to Hee-sung's place. Since Jae Ki-young offered, Dan thought that perhaps he's not really mad after all, even though he'd been cold and quite the whole day. As the two of them headed out, Dan felt nervous. Since this is the first time that Jae Ki-young is doing something like this, Dan is so absorbed in his own thoughts that he doesn't even notice the paper bag that Jae Ki-young is holding as they go out. Not that he'll have any idea what's in it, even if he did. Probably. Anyways, today they're using a different car, which just made Dan wonder just how many cars Jae Ki-young has. But once again, Jae Ki-young didn't say anything, and instead just brought the paper bag inside and starts driving. Suddenly, Jae Ki-young asks Dan if he's feeling grateful for the ride he's giving him. Not really understanding why he would ask that, Dan admits that he does. It seems like Jae Ki-young has some ideas for how Dan should show his appreciation. Jae Ki-young then pulls out a black hole toy from the paper bag he brought and instructs Dan to keep it inside him until they arrive at Hee-sung's place. The catch is that Dan has to hold back any urges, or else he'll ruin his pants. Jae Ki-young admits that he has been in a bad mood as of late. Thus, there's a need for him to have some fun to cheer him up. Jae Ki-young even goes as far as pointing out how his mood is also part of his overall condition, to which Dan is responsible for. Safe to say, baby Dan is horrified.